He had it all: fame, fortune, women, and a voice that shook the world. But Rod Stewart's greatest hits never revealed the truth. The secret child he gave away, the cancers he fought in silence, and the nights when even stardom couldn't save him from despair. Behind the glittering legend was a man breaking inside. Before the stadiums, before the glamour, Rod Stewart was just a skinny boy from North London with wild hair and dreams far too big for the streets he walked. Born in 1945 to a Scottish plumber father and an English mother, Rod grew up in a modest home where money was tight, but love and music floated in the air. His father adored football, and young Rod seemed destined to follow the pitch rather than the stage. In fact, he trained as an apprentice professional player, chasing a ball across muddy fields with the same fire that one day would ignite his music. But there was something restless inside him. He would linger at record shops, soaking up the raw power of American blues and soul records. He idolized Little Richard, Sam Cooke, and Muddy Waters' voices that carried both pain and passion. Music became his secret weapon, the escape hatch from an ordinary life. And though his early years were filled with scraped knees and football chants, the boy who once dreamed of goals was already being pulled by a different destiny, one that would eventually change music history. Rod's leap from the football pitch to the music stage was anything but smooth. In his late teens, he drifted between jobs: gravedigger, silk screen printer, and even a stint in the family plumbing trade. But every time he tried to settle into normal work, music clawed its way back. He began busking in London's train stations, his raspy voice echoing off cold concrete, earning a few coins from hurried commuters. Those rough performances toughened him, teaching him how to grab an audience's attention in seconds, a skill that would serve him for life. By the early 1962nd, Rod fell in with London's vibrant music scene, where blues and rock were colliding with youth culture. He played harmonica and sang with small-time groups, learning the ropes the hard way in smoky clubs filled with restless kids. A pivotal moment came when he was spotted by Long John Baldry, a blues singer who took him under his wing. Touring with Baldry's band gave Rod not just exposure but also a real taste of life on the road, the sleepless nights, the camaraderie, the chaos. It was during this period that Rod honed his image as much as his sound. His spiky hair, thrift shop suits, and streetwise swagger set him apart from other singers trying to mimic American idols. He wasn't polished, but he was raw, and that rawness was electrifying. When he finally joined Jeff Beck Group in the late 1962nd, his transformation was almost complete. For the first time, the world could see that this scrappy boy from North London wasn't just chasing a dream, he was on the edge of becoming a force that would reshape rock forever. When Rod Stewart joined the Jeff Beck Group in 1967, his raspy vocals finally had the thunderous guitar backdrop they deserved. The band earned a cult following, and though it never reached massive mainstream success, it placed Rod directly on the map as one of rock's most compelling frontmen. His performances were raw, unpredictable, and magnetic audiences couldn't take their eyes off the lanky singer with the wild hair and defiant sneer. But it was his move to Faces in 1969 that turned him from a rising talent into a household name. Alongside guitarist Ronnie Wood, Rod embraced the band's loose, chaotic energy. Their shows were notorious for being as much a party as a performance beer bottles on stage. Sloppy but thrilling musicianship, and Rod leading the charge like a ringleader who refused to follow rules. For fans, Faces represented freedom, rebellion, and the kind of messy joy only rock and roll could deliver. At the same time, Rod launched his solo career, a rare gamble that paid off beyond imagination. His 1971 album, Every Picture Tells a Story, exploded with the global anthem, Maggie May. Suddenly, Rod wasn't just a singer, he was the voice of the era, a bridge between the blues grit of the 62nd and the arena, filling spectacle of the 72nd. His raspy tone, once dismissed as too unpolished, became his trademark and his greatest weapon. By the mid-1972nd, Rod Stewart had conquered both sides. the rowdy frontman of Faces, and the solo star-topping charts worldwide. He had the stadiums, the headlines, and the adoration. Yet with every step higher, the seeds of his personal struggles, chaotic relationships, restless ambition, and the creeping fear of losing it all were already being sown behind the glitter. With Maggie May cementing his name in music history, Rod Stewart entered the 1972nd and 82nd as a global superstar. He wasn't just another rock singer. He was the hitmaker, capable of turning every album into a cultural event. Songs like Tonight's the Night, Do Ya Think I'm Sexy, and Sailing became not just chart toppers but generational anthems. His raspy voice carried a raw vulnerability that made even his wildest party tracks feel intimate, as if he were whispering his truth through the chaos. But with superstardom came the image that would define him in tabloids and gossip columns. Rod Stewart, the playboy. He flaunted designer suits, leopard print jackets, flashy cars, and a rotating cast of beautiful women on his arm. Paparazzi chased him through London clubs and Los Angeles mansions, capturing him with models and actresses who seemed to change as quickly as his hairstyles. The public saw him as the ultimate ladies' man, and for years, Rod leaned into that image. Yet beneath the glamour was a man spiraling into excess. His relationships were brief, often explosive, and left behind a trail of heartbreak. He lived in a blur of champagne, stadium tours, and tabloid scandals. But even as he smiled for cameras, he quietly began to realize that the persona of Rod Stewart, the rock god, the seducer, was slowly swallowing the man inside. The world adored the playboy, but Rod himself was already starting to feel the weight of a life lived too fast and too shallow. While his career soared, Rod Stewart's private life became a carousel of drama. He fathered children with different partners, but stability was always out of reach. His name was constantly splashed across tabloids, not only for the women he dated, but for the stormy nature of those romances. Behind the image of the confident rock star was a man who struggled with loyalty, responsibility, and the constant pull between fame and family. Relationships with women like Britt Eklund and Alana Hamilton were fiery, passionate, and ultimately short-lived. Rod's tendency to chase excitement left him restless, unable to settle for long. He craved the thrill of new love, but each breakup carved deeper cracks in his personal life. Friends often described him as generous and funny, yet equally reckless and evasive when things became too real. And with children arriving from different relationships, the strain grew heavier. While Rod provided materially, he was rarely present. Tours, parties, and the endless grind of fame pulled him away, leaving guilt and fractured connections behind. To the outside world, he looked like a man who had everything: success, wealth, and a never-ending string of romances. But inside, Rod was beginning to feel the chaos of his choices catching up, and the shadow of regret loomed larger with each passing year. By the time the 1982nd rolled in, Rod Stewart was not only a global superstar but also a father many times over. He had 7 children with 5 different women, and while that fact alone became tabloid fodder, the real story was far more painful. Rod himself later admitted that in his younger years, he was far from the attentive father he should have been. He provided luxury homes, private schools, and every material comfort. But what his children often lacked was his presence. The demands of touring meant he was rarely home for birthdays, milestones, or even simple family dinners. Instead, his kids grew up watching their father on television, hearing him on the radio, or seeing his face on magazine covers rather than across the breakfast table. Some of them spoke later about the loneliness of being Rod Stewart's child, a label that brought recognition but also a sense of abandonment. Rod's guilt grew heavier as time passed. He would later say in interviews and his autobiography that he had been selfish, caught in the whirlwind of fame and women, neglecting the most sacred role of all. His elder children especially bore the brunt of this absence, and though reconciliation came with time, the scars of those early years lingered. For Rod Stewart, the stage was always full, but at home, there were empty chairs around the table, silent reminders of the price his family paid for his stardom. Among all the complicated chapters of Rod Stewart's family life, one stood apart as the most haunting. When he was just a struggling young musician in the early 1962nd, long before fame and fortune arrived, Rod fathered a daughter with his teenage girlfriend, Susanna Boffey. At the time, he was barely able to take care of himself, let alone raise a child. With no stable income, no career, and little understanding of responsibility, Rod agreed to something that would torment him for decades, giving his baby girl up for adoption. Her name was Sarah, and she was placed in the care of another family, while Rod carried on chasing his dream. Publicly, it was a story buried in silence. Privately, it gnawed at him. As he rose to fame and became a symbol of success and excess, that single choice cast a long shadow over every triumph. In interviews years later, he admitted that the guilt never truly left him, that he often thought of Sarah and wondered what her life had become. When they eventually reunited as adults, the meeting was bittersweet, an attempt at reconnection after years of absence, but also a reminder of the time that could never be reclaimed. For Rod Stewart, this secret was more than a youthful mistake. It was the deepest wound in his personal story. No matter how many sold-out concerts or platinum records he achieved, the memory of handing over his daughter remained the silent verse he could never sing. Rod Stewart's love life was as famous as his music, a never-ending carousel of whirlwind romances, glamorous weddings, and bitter separations. In the 1972nd, he fell hard for Swedish actress Britt Ekland. Their relationship burned fast and bright, the ultimate rock and roll fantasy. But like many of Rod's loves, it collapsed under the weight of jealousy, infidelity, and the relentless spotlight. Britt later described the affair as intoxicating, yet destructive, and Rod admitted he hadn't been ready for commitment. In 1979, he married Alana Hamilton, the ex-wife of actor George Hamilton. The marriage brought him 2 children and a taste of family stability, but it also exposed the cracks in Rod's restless nature. Fame, temptation, and his own inability to settle led to their divorce in 1984. Soon after, he found love again with model Kelly Emberg, a relationship that ended in court battles when it collapsed. Perhaps the most public of his marriages was to supermodel Rachel Hunter in 1990. Rod, already in his mid-40s, fell head over heels for the New Zealand beauty who was less than half his age. He claimed she was his soulmate, declaring he would never need another woman. Yet within a decade, the marriage disintegrated, leaving Rod devastated. He admitted the breakup drove him to one of the darkest emotional periods of his life. Each relationship seemed to follow a pattern: passion, extravagance, and promises of forever followed by betrayal, exhaustion, and collapse. For tabloids, it was irresistible drama. For Rod, it was a cycle that left scars deeper than he cared to admit. Behind every breakup was another piece of his heart splintered, feeding the loneliness that fame could never soothe. On stage, Rod Stewart was electric, swaggering, joking, and dancing as though life was one endless party. The crowds saw the leopard print jackets, the flashy smiles, and the endless energy. What they didn't see was the emptiness that followed when the lights went down. Alone in hotel suites after sold-out shows, Rod often found himself drowning in silence, a silence so heavy it was almost unbearable. The pressure to constantly perform, to keep being Rod Stewart the legend, began to feel like a prison. Friends remembered how he could make a room laugh one moment and then retreat into brooding quiet the next. The man who looked invincible to millions was privately fragile, plagued by doubts about his worth beyond the stage. Women, parties, and excess distracted him for a while, but once the adrenaline faded, the loneliness always returned. Rod himself admitted in later years that he wore a mask during those decades. He gave fans the charming playboy and the eternal rock star, but underneath he felt isolated, even misunderstood. He longed for stability, for someone who would see the vulnerable man rather than the celebrity. Yet his own restless choices made that impossible. The applause was deafening, but when it stopped, Rod Stewart was left alone with his regrets. For Rod Stewart, His voice was more than an instrument, it was his identity, the raw, raspy gift that had carried him from London clubs to the world's biggest arenas. But in the late 1992, that very gift began to falter. He noticed his range shrinking, high notes slipping away, and a persistent hoarseness that refused to heal. What started as a nuisance became a nightmare. For a singer who lived through his sound, the fear of losing his voice was the fear of losing himself. Doctors initially reassured him, but the symptoms worsened until he could barely get through a rehearsal. On stage, he pushed through, hiding the struggle from fans who expected the same powerful Rod they had always known. Off stage, though, the frustration was crushing. He would cancel sessions, cancel shows, and retreat in despair, wondering if his career was over. The tabloids speculated about burnout, about age finally catching up, but few knew just how terrified Rod truly was. When the diagnosis of thyroid cancer came in 2000, everything clicked into place. Surgery to remove the tumor was necessary, but it carried the risk of permanently damaging his vocal cords. For Rod Stewart, it was like being asked to gamble his soul. The thought of waking up and never singing again haunted him. In those moments, stripped of bravado and playboy swagger, Rod faced the terrifying reality that the very thing that defined him, the voice that built his empire, might vanish forever. The surgery to remove his thyroid tumor in 2000 was successful, but the recovery was brutal. Rod Stewart was forced into silence for months, unable to sing a single note while his vocal cords healed. For a man whose entire life revolved around performance, it felt like being locked inside his own body. The stage lights went dark, the audiences disappeared, and Rod was left alone with his thoughts. It was during this time that depression crept in, slowly but relentlessly. He confessed later that he would sit in silence, wondering if his career was already over, if the legend of Rod Stewart had come to an unceremonious end. The man who had once commanded stadiums now struggled to find purpose in his own home. Friends noticed his mood swings, one day hopeful, the next sunk in despair. Even when surrounded by family, he often felt isolated, his mind replaying old regrets and the choices that had cost him so much. And though he eventually recovered enough to sing again, the shadow of that period never fully lifted. Rod realized that fame couldn't protect him from the battles of the mind. The depression wasn't just about losing his voice, it was about everything he had sacrificed along the way. The absent years as a father, the broken marriages, the feeling that beneath the glitter, he had built a life on shaky ground. In those silent months, he confronted the darkest truth of all. Rod Stewart, the eternal showman, was deeply vulnerable when the music stopped. The official diagnosis, thyroid cancer, landed like a hammer blow. In 2000, at the very peak of his fame as a global touring icon, Rod Stewart was suddenly forced to confront mortality in the most personal way. The tumor on his thyroid explained the changes in his voice, but the treatment required surgery that could permanently silence it. For a man whose entire identity was built on that raspy, unforgettable sound, the risk felt like staring into an abyss. Rod entered surgery with dread, unsure whether he would ever sing again. Doctors warned him that even if the cancer was removed, the delicate work around his vocal cords could leave lasting damage. As he was wheeled into the operating room, he admitted later, his mind kept circling back to the same thought: what am I if I can't sing? Fame, money, women, none of it mattered without the voice that had defined his life. The surgery succeeded in removing the tumor, but the recovery was agonizing. Rod was instructed not to sing for months, to let the muscles heal, to protect the fragile cords that had carried decades of music. He tried to speak, but even his speaking voice sounded weak, foreign, almost unrecognizable. For a man so used to projecting strength and charisma, the vulnerability was crushing. Still, Rod fought. He went through months of vocal therapy, learning to carefully rebuild his instrument note by note. Each small improvement felt like a victory, and slowly, the rasp returned different, but still uniquely his. By the time he stepped back onto the stage, fans roared with relief. Rod had faced the possibility of silence and clawed his way back, but the battle left scars. He knew then that every song he sang moving forward was not just performance, it was survival. If thyroid cancer had shaken him, the next diagnosis was a cruel reminder that life never stops testing even the strongest. In 2017, Rod Stewart was diagnosed with prostate cancer. By then, he was already in his 70s, a survivor of the wild decades, and many assumed he was untouchable. But behind the curtain, Rod was fighting another war this time, one he chose to keep secret from the world. He underwent treatment quietly, telling only his closest family and friends. On stage, he was still the eternal showman, strutting in sequin jackets and belting out hits as if nothing had changed. But backstage, there were days of fatigue, endless medical checkups, and the gnawing fear of what the future held. Unlike the thyroid cancer that had threatened his voice, this battle threatened his very existence. Rod later revealed he had kept silent for 2 years, not wanting his fans to worry or pity him. "I didn't want to be a burden," he admitted, describing how he tried to turn every concert into a celebration of life while privately living with uncertainty. When he finally went public in 2019, it was not to seek sympathy but to raise awareness, encouraging men to get regular checkups and not to ignore their health. His resilience inspired many, but it also peeled back another layer of the mask. Beneath the swagger and playful smile was a man who had stared down mortality twice, and each time returned to the stage with renewed gratitude. The world saw the survivor, but only Rod knew how heavy the secret struggle had been, how close he had come to losing it all. Even after surviving 2 battles with cancer, Rod Stewart could not escape the creeping shadow of time. For a man who had built his life on energy, swagger, and the image of eternal youth, aging was more than a natural process. It was an enemy he couldn't outsing or outdance. As the years piled on, Rod admitted to friends and in interviews that he felt a gnawing fear of losing control over his body, his image, and even his legacy. His once boundless stamina on stage required more effort. He trained rigorously, watching his diet, exercising, and even adjusting the way he performed just to maintain the illusion of the same Rod Stewart fans had adored for decades. But behind closed doors, he confessed that the thought of decline haunted him. He would joke about his spiky hair and flashy outfits, but those jokes often masked the truth. Rod was terrified of being forgotten, of turning into a shadow of his former self. The fear wasn't only physical. Aging forced him to confront regrets he had long tried to bury. Missed moments with his children, failed marriages, friendships that had slipped away, all came rushing back with a sharper sting. He admitted that success had distracted him from life's deeper meaning, and now, with time running shorter, those losses felt heavier than ever. Still, Rod refused to surrender completely to age. He reinvented himself through new albums, new tours, and even a softer public persona. Yet the glimmer in his eye often carried something else, a recognition that no spotlight, no song, no applause could shield him forever from the inevitable. The playboy image was fading, the rock god was aging, and Rod Stewart was left to wrestle with the reality that every standing ovation was one step closer to his final bow. For all his wealth, accolades, and decades of adoration, Rod Stewart's deepest wounds came not from the stage, but from the people who shared his blood. The guilt of being an absent father weighed on him heavily as he grew older. He openly admitted that in his younger years, he was selfish, too focused on chasing success, women, and the rush of fame to notice the quiet needs of his children. He could buy them toys, cars, or holidays, but he could never buy back the time he had missed. With his older children especially, the distance was undeniable. They had grown up watching their father in newspapers and on television rather than across the dinner table. Some carried that resentment into adulthood, forcing Rod to face uncomfortable conversations. He tried to make amends, often showering them with love and attention later in life. But he knew the scars from his absence would never fully heal. "I can't change the past," he once admitted, "but I can try to be better now." Even with his younger children from later marriages, Rod struggled against the same old patterns, touring schedules, long stretches away from home, the constant pull of his career. He wanted to be present, to break the cycle, but the demands of being Rod Stewart never fully allowed it. As a result, there were moments when history threatened to repeat itself, leaving him anxious about whether he had truly learned from his mistakes. These regrets became more pronounced as illness and aging reminded him of life's fragility. Rod could fill stadiums, but he could not erase the ache of knowing some of his children had grown up without him. Behind the flashy persona and the bravado was a father haunted by the simplest of failures, not being there when his children needed him most. When Rod Stewart finally decided to write his autobiography, he knew it could not just be a glossy recount of fame and fortune. For decades, he had worn the mask of the eternal playboy and the indestructible rock star. But on the pages of his memoir, he chose to peel that mask away. What emerged was a series of startlingly honest confessions, raw admissions, that revealed the vulnerable man behind the leopard print jackets. He admitted to mistakes that tabloids had only ever speculated about: his reckless treatment of women, his failures as a father, and the crushing guilt of giving up his daughter Sarah for adoption. Instead of dodging the truth, he confronted it head-on, describing the sleepless nights and the pangs of regret that had followed him like a shadow throughout his career. For the first time, fans were not seeing Rod the legend. They were seeing Rod the flawed human being. The most haunting confession came when he wrote, "I had it all. Money, fame, women, but I don't know if I ever had peace." That single line struck at the heart of his life story. It captured the paradox of his existence. Adored by millions, yet plagued by inner turmoil no applause could silence. His memoir wasn't a victory lap, it was a reckoning, a way of finally acknowledging the truths he had avoided for so long. Readers praised the honesty, but for Rod, the act of confessing was more than catharsis. It was a way of confronting his legacy, of leaving behind not just the music but also the truth of the man who sang it. The confessions did not erase the mistakes, but they allowed him to reclaim his story, warts, regrets, and all. By the time Rod Stewart entered his later years, his place in music history was undeniable. He had sold over 120 million records worldwide, making him one of the best-selling artists of all time. His voice, instantly recognizable after just a few notes, became woven into the soundtrack of multiple generations. Songs like Maggie May, Sailing, Tonight's the Night, and Forever Young were not just hits, they became cultural landmarks, played at weddings, funerals, and every celebration in between. Beyond the charts, Rod's influence stretched into fashion and identity. His spiky blonde hair and flamboyant style became trademarks, inspiring countless imitators and cementing his status as one of rock's most charismatic figures. He embodied both grit and glamour, bridging the raw authenticity of blues with the theatricality of arena rock. Few artists could straddle that line so effortlessly, and even fewer could sustain it across 5 decades. His legacy was also felt in how he spoke openly about survival, surviving poverty, surviving heartbreak, surviving cancer. In doing so, he inspired fans not just to celebrate the music, but to recognize the resilience of the man behind it. Younger musicians credited him as a pioneer, someone who showed that vulnerability and toughness could coexist in the same voice. Even as critics dissected his personal failings, the sheer impact of his art was undeniable. Rod Stewart was no longer just a rock star, he was a cultural institution. His legacy wasn't only about records sold or awards won, it was about the way his songs captured life's contradictions: joy and sorrow, triumph and regret, love and loss. In that sense, his music became more than entertainment. It became testimony to the human condition. As Rod Stewart looks back on the extraordinary arc of his life, the story is no longer just about the glamorous rock god who dominated stages and tabloids. It is about the man who carried invisible scars beneath the sequins. He gave the world timeless anthems, yet privately wrestled with regret over a daughter given away, children he missed growing up, and loves that ended in heartbreak. He battled cancers in silence, faced the terror of losing his voice, and endured nights when depression pressed harder than the applause ever could. And yet, Through every storm, Rod endured. He reinvented himself, found ways to laugh, and stood again on the stage even after fate tried to silence him. His life is a reminder that legends are not born from perfection but from survival, the ability to keep singing even when the heart is heavy. Rod Stewart's music will always be celebrated, but the truth behind the music may be his most lasting legacy. A story of brilliance, mistakes, resilience, and the eternal search for peace. When the lights dim and the final encore fades, what remains is not only the myth of Rod Stewart, but the man who dared to reveal his wounds. And in that vulnerability, perhaps, lies the greatest song he never sang.